I would have started with good afternoon, everyone, but I don't think we can say the afternoon's good until it's gone, right? So, and after lunch, all of you are pretty sleepy, so I'm going to try to wake you up as much as I can. And like, I know what Bhavani said, like I am someone who masters writing CSS. I absolutely hate writing CSS. And that was the main reason why I even thought about writing a talk about the unbearable lightness of writing CSS. But do we have any literature nerds in the house? Okay, very few. But the title is an inspiration from a book by Milan Kundera called The Unbearable Lightness of Being. If you haven't read that book, I would recommend you to do. So when it comes to the unbearable lightness of writing CSS, before I dive more into why the talk is titled as such and what are we actually going to deal with, a little bit about me. I'm on Twitter as Shuvam360. I'm still going to call it Twitter because I can't bring myself to call it X. I'm a software tinkerer, I'm a photographer, I like writing code, which is why I don't do it for a living. So that's me. I did a bunch of things. The photos from a time when I was too pissed off at my facial hair and I chopped it all off. So before we move into the next part of the talk, this is a talk that's going to happen in 3 acts. We have Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. This talk is more about what we don't usually use in CSS. What are the things that exist in CSS but we don't leverage it or use it in our day-to-day lives? Because let's accept it, even if a lot of us are front-end engineers in the house, most of us focus more on JavaScript essentials. We focus on React, we focus on Svelte, we focus on Vue. We focus on using Tailwind. But at the end of the day, if you're using Tailwind, you're not writing CSS, right? The main idea behind this talk is to make sure how it gets fun to write CSS, how you can make CSS something which you would enjoy writing, and how you can actually decrease the enormous manual labor it takes to do something in CSS. Because I would admit, it does. So this talk is not about how beautiful CSS is, whether CSS is a programming language or not. In my view, it is, but I wouldn't be entertaining questions to the contrary. So this talk is mostly about how we can make the experience of writing CSS and how to be better and more fun experience for all front-end engineers who have to deal with it every single day. A brief history of cascading style sheets. Anybody here knows who invented CSS? Anyone in the house? No? Okay. Small history lesson for you. I promise I would keep it short and not boring. So Hakum Lai. Yeah, CSS was written by a guy whose name is literally ends with Lai. And when he was a PhD candidate at CERN, his dissertation is essentially what became cascading style sheets. He was one of the people working directly with Tim Berners-Lee. And before web started getting popular, when it was only used for like research folks and people with deep understanding of the web, it was mostly about, you have a page with a bunch of links, with a bunch of writings, and that was all. But as soon as web started going mainstream, we needed ways to make it look prettier, make it look better, make it look for other people who are not hardcore researchers or hardcore people who are just coming to read a paper. And that was Hakum Lai's, I keep mispronouncing his name every time, I'm so sorry about that. So he wrote a proposition in 1996, which became how we modernly know it as cascading style sheets. And the first browser to actually implement the CSS spec was a very early browser called Arena, which was also developed by CERN at that point in time. If any of you are into mythology, Arena was later acquired by a company called Yggdrasil Technologies. So if there are like Norse mythology nerds in the house, this is what you can put in your next quiz deck. Act 2 is where we start exploring a bunch of CSS things which you don't use regularly. And one of them is the filter property. How many of you have wanted to use a sepia or a black and white picture in your website and have just taken a direct black and white rendered picture at all? Like, have any of you tried to make an image black and white with CSS? Okay, there are a lot of people in the house, so I wouldn't have a lot of things to say about black and white filter now. But I'm going to move on to the other filters which people have not used a lot about. So filter is a CSS property that lets you manipulate images, that lets you manipulate what you put in an image and how an image is rendered. And when you look deep into filter, it has like a bunch of different things, and not all of them are even covered here. You can blur an image, you can control the opacity, you can control the saturation, sepia, drop shadow, grayscale. I added grayscale twice, didn't I? I added a lot of things twice, but anyway. But the main idea behind filter is you can do a lot of image manipulation directly within the web framework without having to go outside, use an image editing tool, change the image back to the format you want, and then coming back and again rendering it on your page. Filter allows you to do it all easily, and the syntax of filter is pretty easy. Like whenever you have an image, you just add filter, and then the necessary filter with the parameter. We're going to go through a few examples. Blur essentially blurs your image. It adds a blurs of whatever radius you want. Thereafter, I'm leaving brightness and moving on to contrast, because most of these things, brightness, contrast, they work in essentially the same principle. They add a linear multiplier over your image, and you add a parameter based on how much do you want contrast, how much brightness do you want, right? So if you're using the contrast filter, if you add a 0% parameter, the contrast would be like the image would be like completely monochrome. Like there would be no color separation, there would be zero contrast. 100% is what the image you have actually passed as an argument thrives. And if you want to make the image more contrasty, you actually have to move it above 100%. So that's the basic funda of using the contrast filter. The next fun filter is hue rotate. Like a color is composed of 3 different layers: hue, saturation, and luminance. And with hue rotate, you can change the hue in the color wheel by as many degrees as you want and get a different color. Invert works by inverting the entire color space. I kind of wanted to go deep into the color theory of how each of these filters operate, but that would have been like a whole new talk altogether. So today we are going to move on to something else after filter. Has essentially allows you to write conditional statements in CSS. So for example, you want to render, say you have a div or a box called A, right? And you want to check if box A has something in it, then only do something else. And that is what the has pseudo class selector lets you do. It lets you select whatever is inside the argument against whatever the parent div is applied against, and get a proper comparison with, okay, if this exists within this, then you apply style XYZ, whichever you have written. So with has, you can do things like, if box B is within box A, you simply change the color of box A, or like other things that you want to do with the bigger thing outside. Another powerful thing you can do with the CSS filters that you can couple with has is. So the way the is property works is, if you want to select like multiple functions, like multiple classes, multiple elements, and you want to apply a certain conditional to them, you use is. And another super cool thing with has is you can apply conditional logic inside the thing. Like you can chain the commands with and, you can change the commands with or, and you can figure out, okay, these are the exact property mapping I'm looking for, and if it's satisfied, you apply certain styles. If not, you move on to something else. Next up, we have one of the most powerful and one of my favorite features in CSS, and that's calc. So imagine what you can do with calc. This is a big screen, right? When I was designing or building a web page for a screen as small as any of these monitors, they would have a certain font size. Now, how do I ensure that my font scales properly with every screen size without me having to write like 1,000 media queries? The way you do that is by using calc. With calc, you can do something like, you can literally do normal math with it. Like you can pass on any parameter in any way that you want. You can mix and match different units. You can mix and match different styles that you want to actually compute. So for example, instead of just rem and VW here, you could have used 100% plus 3 pixels. So that's the way calc works. It's one of the most powerful functions in CSS, and if you're someone building for the responsive web, yeah, that's a thing. That could have been a thing as well. But if you're building for responsive web, this would have been one of the most powerful functions you would actually have to use in your daily life. But that kind of brings you to the end of Act 2. Like it was all pretty lukewarm until now. Like you have different properties which you haven't used. You have heard about the history of CSS. I want to talk about something more interesting today. We're going to talk about CSS preprocessors. What is a preprocessor? Imagine you having to write a bunch of CSS with no nesting, no variables, no functions, nothing. Like you just write vanilla CSS every single time you have to write. So for example, you're creating a button which is, say, a danger variant of a button. You have to write a lot of different styles again and again and again to handle the button's different states. Now if you have, say, danger, then you have success and warning and failure and n different modes. You have to write n different lines of code every single time just by tweaking small things here and there. The way to kind of actually make that process simpler is what we are going to deal with in Act 3. And one of the most important and most fun CS processors is SAS. And I couldn't help but talk about SAS in the supposedly SAS capital of India. Just as a reminder, I wrote my entire talk around this joke. So it kind of hurts that I got no laughs for that. But yeah, SAS stands for syntactically awesome style sheets. So which basically acts as a superset wrapper on top of cascading style sheets and allows you like modern programming paradigms in which you can write your own CSS. It makes it much easier to do things which would have been much difficult to do earlier, which would have been super repetitive, super boring, and you would have had to do like the same thing again and again and again. Because no matter how good I say CSS is, at the end of the day, you do face scenarios like this, where you have two entirely different classes, two entirely different use cases, but maybe just a small thing changes between them. Just a small parameter change, it's a small filter change, it's a small value change. And to actually accommodate all of that, you have to write the entire thing all over again. Which brings us to SAS. Now there are two ways you can write SAS. Like SAS files have two extensions. One is .sas, which is like the more pleasant alternative to CSS, which has no semicolons in the end, no braces, nothing. It's just like plain hierarchy-based syntax where you just put in the values. The other, more closer to CSS alternative is called SCSS, wherein you essentially write the CSS, but with all the goodness and flavor and all the important enhancements that SAS provides for you. And SAS, whatever you write here in form of like in a .sas file or a .scss file, SAS will essentially compile them all down to like basic vanilla CSS and save you the entire process of having to write all of these things from scratch on your own. The first very important thing is SAS came into existence at around, I think, 2005 or 6. And one of the most important things it introduced was variables. Now, of course, CSS did its own version of variables quite some time later. But SAS was one of the front runners to actually implement variables, where you could just use a $sign. And imagine the time when SAS came out. It was also the same time when jQuery was peaking. So it made sense for them to use the same syntax we used to reference variables and DOM objects in jQuery and bring that onto the same thing in CSS. So you could just define a variable with a $sign, assign it to whatever value you want, and then you can use that throughout the rest of your code. And whenever you change the value of the variable, the entire thing changes. You do not have to go through your entire code base and redo things over and over and over again. So that was variables. The next very crucial thing that SAS introduced for us was nesting. When you're nesting, essentially, instead of writing CSS in the way, .button, .warning, .xyz, and writing 5 different states for the button component where you write .button, say 5 times or 6 times, SAS made it much, much easier. SAS made it way more easier using nesting. In vanilla CSS, you would have to write like button A, you have to write the state of button in danger, you have to say the right of button in warning. With SAS, you can bring all of that under the same umbrella. Like you just define button, and then inside that, all the different states, all different conditions, everything else that you kind of need to think about or realize about is actually present in here. So nesting is another really cool feature that you get in SAS. The other thing is mixins. Mixin, okay, how do I explain mixins? Imagine you have 2 CSS properties in which you want to define. For a button, you want to define, okay, font weight is bold, padding is 10 pixels and 12 pixels, and border is 1 pixel red solid. Now you have another button where you have to rewrite the exact same thing. Font weight bold, border this and that, and all of that. So there's a lot, like one of my major gripes with CSS has always been, there's a hell lot of repetition. And how do we actually get rid of that repetition and actually make things easier for you to write? What mixins allow is mixins allow you to define a predefined set of parameters and their corresponding values. So that whenever you're writing the code or styling a component, you can import a mixin, and then you can just write whatever extra things you need to add on top of that. This is the way mixins work. So in vanilla CSS, I would write for a card, I would define, okay, the display flex direction, background. For another component, I would write the exact same things all over again. When I am using SAS, I can simply define a flex column mixin, where I say, okay, these are 3 properties, and these are the values. And whenever I'm writing the CSS for card or callout, I can simply include them. And then after including them, I can chain my own CSS, write my own parameters, write my own editings on top of that, and this makes things much, much easier. But mixins are only like a small part of the tip of the iceberg that Sass actually explains to you. Sass exposes another really cool thing called functions. When you're using functions in Sass, you can literally bypass the things that has pseudo-class I told you. You can literally write if-else queries within CSS. You can literally write loops within CSS, and which is why I always hold this opinion that CSS is a programming language. Because when the end of the day you can do conditionals and loops using CSS, there is not a lot of things which are actually missing from the language at that point of view. So let's take a look at how functions work. When you're using a function, you can literally use any variable, you can use any mixin and use the parameters from them to actually see, okay, if my theme is dark, I would render it in this way. If my theme is light, I would render it in this way. And pretty much every single different scenario. Having conditionals is a really powerful feature of Sass that makes it much more interesting for us. All right. So if this is how conditional statements work in Sass, you'd obviously be wondering then how would you do loops, right? Like, it's difficult to do loops in the basic construct of CSS that we have known and seen from now on. The best thing about Sass is you already have variables. And you can use a variable to define an array. Now, once you have an array, you can simply cycle through them using @each. This is a very similar way you write cycling, like you write loops in JavaScript as well at times. So the syntax is much similar, and you can do it right in CSS. You don't have to, add an extra JavaScript file to add classes later, render it in some other way. With Sass, you can literally do it in seconds. Define an array, and it's not like this array can just be of static values. This array can be of anything under the sun. You can make an array of variables. You can make an array of variables of variables. You can nest it in however much deep you want. And when you combine all of these things, when you combine mixins, functions, variables, nesting, you get a very powerful tool built on top of CSS that makes it much easier for you to write the code that you want to write. And once you start using Sass, you would actually come across a lot of different other preprocessors. You would come across less. You would come across a bunch of other tools that actually do similar things under the hood. And the reason I just talked about Sass was because this was Chennai. And so yeah, that was the end of Act 3. This was a short talk, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, happy to take them. No questions on CSS is a new thing I'm seeing, but okay. Yo, you have one. So the question was, how is less different from Sass and like other preprocessors? I don't have a lot of idea, to be very honest. Like, I haven't gone under the hood and see how they actually implement things and change things. But like less has a lot of similar features as Sass, and I would probably have to like research a bit, dig a bit deeper for me to actually answer this question for you. There's another question after that.
So in this era of Tailwind, why would someone consider SCSS? That's a question I have, because now a lot of developers are used to Tailwind. It'll be migrating from Tailwind to SCSS or all of these preprocessors, and then there's post CSS, CSS Nano, and all of that. So why would one developer migrate from that background to this?
I would ask you one counter question in return. When you're using Tailwind, are you writing CSS or are you writing HTML?
I'm writing HTML snippets, and
exactly.
I'm adding.
So when you're not controlling the exact tokens that you're using in your HTML, you are giving up a lot of leverage that you have to control the basic components driving your front end. You can't do a lot of designs with just Tailwind or using just the predefined Tailwind tokens that Tailwind exposes for you. If you want to build, say, a website like that of Vercel or Linear, they wouldn't be using just Tailwind around the hood. Tailwind is useful as a starting point. It's useful to do a lot of things which you have to manually do otherwise. But when you want to go deep and build out a bunch of cool features, a bunch of cool visualizations, you would have to dig deep and write CSS at the end of the day. And if you have to write CSS itself any day, you might as well use something like Sass. You had a question.
Just add any plugins for using this one, SCSS?
You need to add a Sass compiler, and the project takes care of it, everything on its own.
Okay.
Like, it's not a big deal. Like, it's not a very complicated process to set up. Like, if you just Google like how to set up Sass on my project, it would just give you, okay, hey, these are the configs you need to put, these are the targets you need to set, and that's all. Like, it's not as complicated as setting up a React project.
Okay, that's
might
what
add.
I just want to understand. Okay.
Will you prefer Tailwind? I mean, we are writing HTML instead of CSS, right? As you said. Will you prefer Tailwind or
If you are asking about preference, I hate Tailwind. I like rolling my own CSS.
Usually, I got a class with my manager. Like, I'll say, write a class and write CSS. This is my way of styling. Styling the part. But when it comes to my manager style, he always told me to write a.
It makes sense to use Tailwind in a lot of scenarios where you don't need to write something from scratch, or wherever you don't need that sort of granular control over how your code is styled or how your visualization is like taken care of. For example, if you are building a button, there are like 5 different people who have already built a button before. Tailwind exposes the button CSS for you. In that scenario, you wouldn't really need a novel scenario to use something like Sass or Less or CSS in general. Like, if it's already defined for you, don't work for it. But say you want to build again, another example I would give another person there. If you want to build something like, say, the homepage of Vercel or homepage of Linear, they have a lot of different smaller tweaks, small Easter eggs, which are not always possible with Tailwind, right? Even if you use Tailwind, you have to define your own custom Tailwind class, write CSS for that, and then import that into HTML and work, right? So if in the end of the day, the main solution is to write CSS, why are you not using, like, my preference is to always use the thing that I'm having to write anyway from the day one. So, yeah.
Are there any downsides to using the preprocessors, CSS preprocessors?
Downsides means it's just going to add like one extra dependency to your project. But again, if you're using React, like using Sass dependency is a much less thing that you have to worry about.
So my question is, consider like managing a large application like 10 to 15 micro front end. Okay, so that time like each team will have their own CSS, and that time will it that CSS will like it will make difficult for them, right? How will you manage CSS? Like when you are writing a CSS for the enterprise application where they have 10 to 15 micro front end. So that time it will make difficult, right?
I think that's more of like a design system question than a CSS question. Because when you're writing a design system or whenever you want to have a consistency across, say, 15 different teams working for the same company, and you want to have like a same visual flair to all of their projects, that's more of a design system question. And design system questions are, again, incredibly subjective. You might want to use Tailwind because the Tailwind defaults gives you a consistent look already. You might want to use a custom theme with Tailwind. You might want to use a custom CSS template. You might want to use just a set of CSS variables to standardize things. So it's more of a design system question than writing a CSS question. And it kind of depends on from the person to person, company to company, what the leadership would want to kind of actually implement and build out from there.
Like in this era of AI technology, is it still valid to learn CSS? Because if you use ChatGPT, within a fraction of seconds, you can generate lots of CSS as well as all codes. Like, is it valid? If it is valid, why so?
When we come to a question about using ChatGPT, I think I would have much different opinion from other people you might have heard of. I am dead against using ChatGPT for anything that goes into production. Like, not for the code, not for styles, not for anything. Like, ChatGPT for me has always been just a companion to brainstorm with. And I would never just outpaste a ChatGPT code snippet in my production code. Because at the end of the day, you would always have to debug. It's not like ChatGPT is running the code, figuring out whether it works or not, and then giving it to you, right? Tomorrow, if somebody builds a tool where you get a code recommendation which compiles and executes and tells you, okay, hey, this is good, this is bad, this is what works, this is what does not work, maybe then I would want to use it. But if I have to just get boilerplate code and do the rest of the things manually, I prefer to do the rest of the things manually. So yeah, that was it. That's my time. Thank you, folks. And I will see you again next time, hopefully.